This is a true story about a man who died in World War II, yet came back to life. A man whose family buried an empty casket while he fought on the opposite side of Europe. A soldier who experienced something no other American ever has, before or since. What you are about to hear sounds impossible, but every word is verified by historical record. This is the story of Joseph Beyrle, the only American to fight for both the United States Army and the Soviet Red Army in the same war. Before we begin, subscribe to this channel and stay with us until the very end, because the final moments of this story will leave you speechless. And please, write in the comments which city, state, or country you are watching from. We want to know where our community is listening from around the world. Now, let us take you back to June 5, 1944. The aircraft shuddered violently as flak burst around it in the darkness above the English Channel. Inside the cramped fuselage of the C-47 transport, 20 paratroopers sat in 2 rows, their static lines clipped to the cable running overhead. Joseph Beyrle, a private first class in the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division, could taste copper in his mouth. His hands gripped the reserve chute strapped to his chest. The jumpmaster stood by the open door, wind screaming past him, his face lit intermittently by the orange glow of explosions outside. They were heading into Normandy hours before the beach landings would begin. Their mission was to drop behind German lines, seize bridges and crossroads, and create chaos in the enemy rear. Beyrle had trained for this moment for 2 years. He had jumped out of aircraft dozens of times over the forests and fields of England. But training had never included tracer rounds slicing through the night, had never replicated the smell of burning aviation fuel, had never prepared him for the possibility that the aircraft itself might disintegrate before he could jump. The red light near the door glowed like a dying coal. The jumpmaster held up his hand. 5 fingers, 4, 3. The aircraft bucked again, harder this time, and someone behind Beyrle swore into the roar of the engines. Then green light. The jumpmaster screamed the command, and the first man launched himself into the void. Beyrle shuffled forward with the line, his boots scraping metal, his breath coming fast and shallow. Then he was at the door, looking down into an abyss of smoke and fire. And then he was out, falling, the slipstream tearing at his face. The opening shock came hard, jerking him upright, but something was wrong. He looked up and saw his canopy tangled, only partially inflated. He was descending faster than he should, spinning slightly, the ground rising up to meet him with terrifying speed. He pulled his risers, trying to steer toward an open field, but the wind had other plans. Trees loomed up in the darkness. He pulled his legs together and covered his face with his arms. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Branches snapped and scraped his body. He crashed through layers of foliage before slamming into the ground on his back. For several seconds he could not move, could not breathe, could only stare up at the tangled parachute silk caught in the trees above him. When his lungs finally reinflated, the pain came with them. His ribs screamed. His shoulder burned. But he could move his fingers, could move his toes. Nothing broken. He lay still and listened. Distant gunfire chattered in multiple directions. Aircraft engines throbbed overhead. Somewhere close by, a cow lowed in confusion. He had no idea where he was. He had no idea where his unit was. The drop had scattered them across miles of French farmland in the dark. He was alone. Beyrle unclipped his harness and rolled to his knees. He pulled out his cricket, the small metal clicker the paratroopers used to identify each other, and squeezed it twice. Click-clack, click-clack. He waited. Nothing. He tried again, still nothing. He gathered his weapon, checked his ammunition, and began moving north, using the distant sound of artillery as his compass. For 3 days he moved through occupied Normandy alone, a ghost behind enemy lines. He blew up a power station using explosives from his demolition kit, plunging a section of German defenses into darkness. He cut telegraph wires along a rural road, disrupting communications. He ambushed a small German patrol at dawn, killing 2 soldiers and disappearing into a hedgerow before the others could react. He survived on field rations and water from streams, sleeping in barns and ditches, always moving, always listening for the sound of American forces he could link up with. But on the 4th day, his luck ended. He was crossing an open field near the town of Saint-Come-du-Mont when German soldiers appeared from a tree line to his left. They shouted commands in a language he barely understood. He ran. Rifle shots cracked across the field. He felt something tug at his pack. He zigzagged, his lungs burning, the tree line ahead impossibly far away. Then his boot caught on something, a root or a furrow, and he went down hard. Before he could rise, they were on him, rifle muzzles pointed at his face, hands tearing away his weapon. They marched him to a farmhouse being used as a temporary command post. A German officer with a thin mustache and tired eyes questioned him in broken English. Name, rank, unit. Beyrle gave his name, his rank, his serial number. Nothing more. The officer sighed and gestured to his men. They stripped Beyrle of his equipment, his helmet, his field jacket. One soldier held up the dog tags hanging from Beyle's neck, then yanked them off with a sharp tug that left the chain cutting into his skin before it snapped free. The soldier pocketed the tags. Beyrle would never see them again. That theft would change everything. Those small metal rectangles stamped with his name and serial number would eventually make their way through the chaos of war to German intelligence, then somehow into reports filed with the Red Cross, and finally into a grim notification sent across the Atlantic. But Beyrle knew none of this as they shoved him into the back of a truck with other captured American and British paratroopers. He only knew he was a prisoner, and that the war, for him, had taken a dark turn. The truck carried them east, away from the fighting, away from any hope of liberation by advancing Allied forces. They passed through villages where French civilians watched with hollow eyes. They passed columns of German troops moving toward the sound of guns. Eventually they arrived at a transit camp, a muddy compound surrounded by barbed wire, where guards herded them into crowded barracks that stank of unwashed bodies and despair. Days blurred into weeks. They were moved again, loaded into railcars designed for cattle, packed so tightly that men had to take turns sitting down. The train rattled eastward across France into Germany, deeper into the Reich. When the doors finally opened, they were at Stalag 12D, a camp for Allied prisoners of war near Trier. The camp was a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by double fences of barbed wire, watchtowers at each corner, searchlights sweeping the grounds at night. The men inside moved like shadows, their faces gaunt, their eyes reflecting a particular kind of exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from the crushing monotony of captivity. Days were measured by roll calls and watery soup. Nights were measured by the gnawing cold and the sounds of men coughing, praying, or quietly weeping. Beyrle could not accept it. He had not survived D-Day, had not fought alone behind enemy lines, only to rot in a cage. Within 2 weeks of arriving, he attempted his first escape. He and another prisoner loosened boards in the barracks floor and crawled under the wire during a rainstorm when visibility was poor. They made it 3 miles before a German patrol found them hiding in a ditch. The guards beat them with rifle butts and threw them into solitary confinement, a windowless cell barely large enough to lie down in, where Beyrle spent 7 days on bread and water. It did not deter him. Over the following months, as he was transferred from camp to camp, Stalag 12D to Stalag 3C, he escaped twice more. Each time he was recaptured. Each time the punishment grew harsher. After his third attempt, the Germans decided he needed special attention. They sent him to Berlin, to a Gestapo facility where prisoners who caused trouble were interrogated with methods designed to break the will. The interrogation room was in a basement, the walls bare concrete, the floor stained with things Beyrle tried not to think about. They asked him questions he could not answer, about troop movements and invasion plans he knew nothing about. When he refused to speak, they beat him methodically. Fists to the body, careful not to leave marks on the face where Red Cross inspectors might see. They hung him by his wrists from a pipe until his shoulders felt like they would tear from their sockets. They deprived him of sleep, dragging him from his cell at random hours, shouting questions, hitting him when he slumped. One night, or perhaps it was day, he could no longer tell, they brought in a new interrogator, a man in a black uniform who spoke perfect English and smiled while he worked. The man explained, almost kindly, that Beyrle would eventually talk because everyone talked, and that resisting only prolonged suffering. Then he applied electrical current to Beyrle's body using a hand-cranked device that sent fire through his nerves. Beyrle screamed. He could not help it. But he did not talk because he had nothing to say. After 2 weeks, they gave up. He was no intelligence asset, just a stubborn paratrooper who knew nothing useful. They sent him back to the camp system, to Stalag 3C near the town of Alt-Druitz. He arrived emaciated, his ribs showing through his skin, his hands still shaking from the interrogations. But he was alive, and he was still Joseph Beyrle. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, in the small town of Muskegon, Michigan, the Beyrle family received a telegram. It was delivered by a boy on a bicycle, who handed it to Joseph's mother on the front porch and then rode away quickly, as if he understood what the message contained. She opened it with trembling hands. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son, Private First Class Joseph Beyrle, has been killed in action in France. The words destroyed her. She collapsed into a chair, the telegram falling from her fingers. Joseph's father came running at the sound of her wailing. Neighbors appeared at the door. The news spread through the town like a cold wind. Joseph Beyrle, the boy who had played baseball in the local park, who had worked at the auto plant before enlisting, who had promised to come home, was dead. They held a funeral service. Friends and family gathered in a church and listened to a chaplain speak about sacrifice and honor. A coffin sat at the front of the room, closed and empty, because there was no body to bury. The official report stated that Joseph had been killed during the Normandy invasion and that his remains could not be recovered. His mother wept into a handkerchief. His father stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his hands folded behind his back. The local newspaper ran an obituary. Joseph Beyrle was mourned, remembered, and then slowly, as the months passed, the sharp pain of his loss faded into the dull ache of memory. But Joseph Beyrle was not dead. He was in Stalag 3C, enduring another winter, planning another escape. The camp sat in a landscape of frozen mud and skeletal trees. Food was scarce. The Red Cross parcels that were supposed to sustain the prisoners arrived sporadically, often pilfered by guards. Men died of dysentery, of pneumonia, of despair. Beyrle survived by trading cigarettes from the Red Cross packages for extra bread, by doing push-ups in the barracks to maintain some thread of strength, by refusing to let the camp consume him. In January of 1945, with the Soviet army advancing from the east and the sound of artillery growing louder each day, the Germans began evacuating the camps. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march westward in columns through snow and ice, guarded by soldiers who shot anyone who fell behind. Beyrle knew that to join that march was to die on the road. He decided to escape one final time, but this time he would not head west toward Allied lines. He would go east, toward the sound of the Russian guns. He slipped away from a work detail on the edge of the camp, crawling under a fence while the guards were distracted by an argument among prisoners. He ran into the woods, his breath clouding in the freezing air, his thin prison uniform offering almost no protection from the cold. Behind him, whistles blew, dogs barked. Gunfire popped in the distance, but he did not stop. He moved through the forest for hours, then days, heading east by the position of the sun when it appeared through the clouds. He had no food, no map, no compass. He ate snow to stave off thirst. He broke into a barn one night and stole a German army greatcoat from a hook, wrapping it around himself despite the risk of being shot as a spy if captured. He kept moving because to stop was to freeze. On the third night he collapsed in a field. His legs simply gave out. He lay in the snow, shivering uncontrollably, staring up at the stars, and wondered if this was finally the end. He thought of his family in Michigan. He thought of the funeral they must have held for him. He thought how strange it was to die so far from home, alone, without anyone knowing he had tried so hard to survive. But then he heard it. Artillery. Not distant thunder, but the deep, rhythmic boom of heavy guns, close enough that he could feel the concussions in his chest. Soviet artillery. He forced himself to his knees, then to his feet. He staggered toward the sound, falling, rising, falling again, until he crested a low hill and saw them below. Tanks, a column of Soviet T-34 tanks, their engines rumbling, their crews standing on the hulls, smoking and talking. Beyrle stumbled down the hill toward them, waving his arms, shouting in English. The crews turned, weapons rising. A soldier leveled a submachine gun at him and barked a command in Russian. Beyrle stopped, hands in the air, and repeated the only Russian word he knew. Amerikansky, Amerikansky. The soldiers exchanged glances. One of them gestured for Beyrle to approach. He walked forward slowly, his hands still raised. They searched him roughly, found nothing but the stolen coat and his emaciated body beneath it. An officer was summoned, a woman with a hard face and a tanker's padded helmet. She looked Beyrle up and down, then spoke to him in broken German, which he did not understand. He replied in English, explaining that he was an American paratrooper, that he had escaped from a German prison camp, that he wanted to fight. The woman, whose name was Alexandra Samyuzenko, regarded him with skepticism. Soviet forces had encountered German soldiers trying to pass themselves off as escaped prisoners. She questioned him for several minutes, probing for inconsistencies. But something in his eyes, or perhaps his desperation, convinced her. She gave a curt nod and gestured for him to climb onto the back of her tank. For the next several weeks, Joseph Beyrle fought alongside the 1st Guards Tank Army as it pushed westward into Germany. Samyuzenko gave him a Soviet uniform, a fur hat, and a PPSH-41 submachine gun, the iconic weapon of the Red Army with its distinctive drum magazine. He rode on the outside of tanks, clinging to the hull as they rumbled through villages and forests. He fought in skirmishes against German rear guard units, firing his weapon from behind cover while Soviet infantry advanced. He learned a few words of Russian, enough to understand basic commands, enough to share dark jokes with the tank crews around campfires at night. The Soviets treated him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. He was a novelty, this American who had appeared out of nowhere and insisted on fighting. Some of the soldiers thought he was insane. Others thought he was the bravest man they had ever met. Samyuzenko seemed to regard him as a kind of good luck charm, and she kept him close to her command tank. In late January, the tank column approached a large prisoner of war camp surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Beyrle felt a strange sensation in his chest as they drew near. The layout looked familiar. The spacing of the buildings, the configuration of the fences. Then he understood. This was Stalag 3C. This was the camp he had escaped from weeks earlier. Soviet tanks smashed through the gates. German guards fled or surrendered. Beyrle jumped down from the tank and walked through the compound as prisoners stumbled out of the barracks, blinking in the daylight, uncertain whether to believe what they were seeing. He recognized faces, men he had lived beside, men who had shared their Red Cross parcels with him, men who had thought he was dead or recaptured. They stared at him as if he were a hallucination. He wore a Soviet uniform. He carried a Soviet weapon, but his face was unmistakable. One man, a British Sergeant Beyrle had played cards with, walked up slowly and stopped a few feet away. "Beyrle, is that you?" Beyrle grinned, the first real smile he had managed in months. "Yeah, it's me." The British sergeant shook his head in disbelief. "They said you were dead. We had a service for you." Beyrle shrugged. "Looks like the reports were exaggerated." The liberation of the camp was chaotic. Soviet soldiers handed out food and vodka. Prisoners wept and embraced. Some were too weak to stand. Others danced in the mud, giddy with the realization that their imprisonment was over. Beyrle moved through the crowd, shaking hands, answering the same question again and again. "How did you end up with the Russians?" He did not stay long. Samusenko's tanks were moving out, pursuing the retreating German forces, and Beyrle went with them. He had unfinished business with this war. But his luck, which had carried him through so much, was about to run out. In early February, the tank column was advancing through open farmland when German aircraft appeared overhead. Junkers Ju-87 dive bombers, the infamous Stukas with their inverted gull wings and screaming sirens. The tanks scattered, trying to find cover, but there was nowhere to hide in the flat terrain. The bombers came in low, their sirens wailing, releasing their payloads. Beyrle was on the hull of a tank when the bombs hit. The explosion lifted him off his feet and threw him through the air. He landed hard on his back, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. He tried to move, but his legs would not respond. He looked down and saw blood, a lot of it soaking through his trousers. Shrapnel had torn through his lower body, shredding muscle and tissue. Soviet medics reached him within minutes. They wrapped him in a blanket and loaded him onto a truck, which carried him to a field hospital several miles behind the front lines. He drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. When he woke, he was on a surgical table, and a Soviet doctor was standing over him, speaking rapidly in Russian. Beyrle understood none of the words, but he understood the doctor's expression. It was not optimistic. He spent weeks in that hospital, teetering between life and death. Infection set in. Fever consumed him. He hallucinated seeing his family, seeing the barracks at Stalag 3C, seeing the face of the Gestapo interrogator with the smile that never reached his eyes. But he did not die. Slowly, agonizingly, his body began to heal. The infection receded. The wounds started to close. Soviet nurses, many of them volunteers from nearby villages, tended to him with a fierce determination. They had seen too many men die, and they refused to let this strange American become another casualty. When he was finally able to sit up, a Soviet officer came to visit him. The officer spoke some English and asked Beyrle to tell his story from the beginning. Beyrle did, leaving nothing out. The officer listened, his expression unreadable, then stood and said he would return. A week later, the officer came back with news. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the supreme commander of Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, wanted to meet him. Beyrle was transported by ambulance to Zhukov's headquarters, a commandeered mansion in a town whose name he never learned. He was still weak, still limping, but he was helped into a large room with maps covering the walls and officers moving with purposeful urgency. And then Zhukov entered, a broad-shouldered man with a blunt face and eyes that seemed to calculate everything instantly. Zhukov listened to Beyrle's story with the same intensity he might apply to a battlefield report. He asked pointed questions. How had the Americans trained their paratroopers? What had German interrogation methods been like? What was the morale of Soviet tank crews compared to what Beyrle had known in the American army? Beyrle answered as honestly as he could. When he finished, Zhukov stood and looked at him for a long moment. "You have fought bravely," he said through a translator. "You have earned the respect of the Red Army. I will see that you get home." It took weeks to arrange. The Soviet bureaucracy was vast and slow, and the war was still raging. But Zhukov's word carried weight. Eventually, Beyrle was put on a train to Moscow, then transferred to the care of the American embassy. The embassy officials did not believe him at first. An American paratrooper who claimed to have fought with the Soviets, who claimed to have been declared dead. It sounded like the invention of a disturbed mind or a con artist. They questioned him closely, checking his story against records, looking for inconsistencies. But then they took his fingerprints, and they checked those prints against the records sent from the United States, and the prints matched. Joseph Robert Beyrle, serial number 160544973, declared killed in action in June of 1944, was standing in front of them, alive. The shock rippled through the embassy. Urgent cables were sent to Washington. Verification was requested and confirmed. The machinery of the War Department, which had declared him dead, now had to declare him alive. A telegram was sent to Muskegon, Michigan. Joseph's mother was in the kitchen when the telegram arrived. She read it 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it. Her son was alive. He was in Moscow. He was coming home. The reunion, when it finally happened weeks later, was beyond words. His mother held him and would not let go, weeping into his shoulder. His father gripped his hand, his face crumpling with emotion he could not contain. His siblings crowded around, touching him as if to confirm he was real. The town of Muskegon erupted in celebration. The boy they had mourned, whose name was carved on a memorial in the town square, had returned from the dead. But Joseph Beyrle did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had survived when too many others had not. He carried the weight of the camps, the weight of the men who had died beside him, the weight of knowing that his survival had been a matter of chance as much as will. He returned to civilian life quietly. He worked at the auto plant again. He married, had children, built a modest life. He rarely spoke about the war. When people asked, he would give short answers and change the subject. The full story remained locked inside him for decades. It was only later, much later, that historians began to piece together the extraordinary scope of what he had experienced. He was the only American soldier known to have fought for both the United States Army and the Soviet Red Army in World War II. He received military honors from both nations, a distinction shared by no one else. The Soviet government awarded him the Order of the Red Star. The United States Army eventually recognized his service with multiple decorations, though it took years for the bureaucracy to catch up with the reality of his story. In his later years, he became more willing to share his experiences. He spoke at schools, at veterans' gatherings, at memorial services. He returned to Russia several times, meeting with veterans of the tank units he had fought beside. He was received with warmth and respect, a living link between two nations that had been allies once, even if only briefly. His son, John Beyrle, would go on to become the United States ambassador to Russia, serving from 2008 to 2012. It was a position that carried symbolic weight, the son of the only American to fight alongside the Red Army representing his country in Moscow. During his tenure, Ambassador Beyrle often spoke of his father's story. using it as a reminder that even in the darkest times, individual acts of courage and connection could transcend borders and ideologies. Joseph Beyrle died in 2004 at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by veterans from multiple nations, by dignitaries, by family and friends. This time, the coffin was not empty. This time, there was a body to lay to rest. And this time, everyone knew that the man inside had lived a life that defied every probability, that had encompassed more suffering and survival than most people could imagine. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we are capable of enduring, about the randomness of survival in war, about the cost of declaring someone dead when they are very much alive. It reminds us that behind every casualty report, every telegram sent to a grieving family, there is a human being whose fate may not yet be sealed. It shows us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it, again and again, even when continuation seems pointless. Joseph Beyrle's war did not end with a heroic charge or a dramatic last stand. It ended with bureaucracy, with fingerprints, with a telegram that undid another telegram. It ended with a quiet return to a life that had moved on without him. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part. After everything he endured, after dying twice and coming back both times, he chose to live simply, to work, to raise a family, to be a man rather than a legend. The world has largely forgotten his name. There are no major motion pictures about his life, no monuments in his honor beyond a small plaque in Muskegon. But those who know his story carry it with them like a secret knowledge, a reminder that the impossible sometimes happens, that the dead sometimes return, and that one man's stubborn refusal to give up can rewrite the official record. If you have stayed with us until the end of this story, thank you. We hope it has moved you, challenged you, or at least made you think about the hidden histories that surround us. If it has, please subscribe to this channel so you can hear more stories like this one. Leave a like on this video if you believe Joseph Beyrle's story deserves to be remembered. And please, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it his escape, his time with the Soviets, or his return from the dead? We want to hear from you. And one more thing, write in the comments which city, state, or country you are watching from. We are building a global community of history lovers, and we want to know where you are listening from tonight. Thank you for being here. And remember, the past is never as distant as we think.